Steinbeck. Tonight at 8 on American Writers 2, John Steinbeck.
America, in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, was the topic of a forum hosted this week by the Close-Up Foundation. Guests on the program include Joyce Davis, Deputy Senior Foreign Editor with Knight Ridder Newspapers. It's about an hour.
Hello, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. for this third in a series of programs between the Close-Up Foundation and the Wilson Center, focusing on the world post the events of 9/11. Hi, I'm John Milewski of the Close-Up Foundation. In a moment, you'll meet students and educators from different parts of the world who are in town for various educational programs. We'll tell you more about those in a moment. But first, I want to introduce you to our co-host for this series. He is the executive producer and host of Dialogue, Mr. George Liston, Seay. George?
John.
George, if you could begin providing us a little scene setting as you traditionally do, and maybe talk to the folks about how we've come through this series and where we are today and what we hope to discuss.
Well, it would be a pleasure, John. This is, as John said, the third in a series of conversations we've been having about the world since September the 11th and about the reality we've all been facing. In the first discussion, we looked at the world in its global context. We then turned to a discussion of domestic concerns about the anti-terrorism struggle. And today, I think, very appropriately, our question is, where do we go from here? And that is a very vast agenda. It includes everything from continuing the combat against terrorism through military and legal means, but it also includes other questions, which I hope we get to address today. How important is it to build and sustain community in a country like this and among countries? How important is it to maintain civil rights as you combat those who would commit acts of terrorism in the world? And maybe most importantly this, how do we begin a meaningful cross-cultural dialogue, one that helps us bridge the difference between civilizations rather than having them clash? And John, if I could add, just by way of evidence, a little article from the New York Times yesterday. I'll only read the headline, because I think the headline speaks for the article. And it reads quite simply, "Bias incidents against Muslims are soaring," Islamic Council says. And I think if nothing else, that gives urgency to our discussion today.
Thank you, George.
Although, George, I didn't like the way everyone looked at me.
I looked out of the corner of my eye. How did you see that? It's amazing. Let me introduce our guests to you. The gentleman with good peripheral vision is Akbar Ahmed. Akbar is a professor of Islamic Studies at American University. He's the author of several books, including Discovering Islam, Making Sense of Muslim History and Society, which was the basis for a 6-part BBC series. Previously, he served as Pakistan's ambassador to the United Kingdom. Joyce Davis is the Deputy Senior Foreign Editor for Knight Ridder Newspapers. She is formerly, or I should say she formerly held that post with National Public Radio, where she specialized in Middle Eastern and African issues. She's the author of Between Jihad and Salam, Profiles in Islam, and her newest book is called Martyrs. It examines the phenomenon of martyrdom in the Islamic world, and that book will be released by the end of the calendar year. David Makovsky is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and is director of the Institute's projects on America, Israel, and the peace process. He's a former executive editor for the Jerusalem Post and is currently a contributing editor to U.S. News and World Report. I want to welcome all of you to the discussion.
Thank you.
One of the subjects that has come up throughout our discussion is what is the problem that we're talking about here? There's a lot of assumption and a lot of sort of trite phraseology now around the events of September 11th that assumes we're all talking about the same thing. We don't want to make that assumption. And one way to phrase the question is, are we talking about a clash of civilizations, or are we talking about a traditional political conflict around which most wars happen? Akbar, can we begin with you?
I don't like the idea of the clash of civilizations, as you know, John. I rather prefer the dialogue of civilizations. But as I see it, unfortunately, regrettably, it is becoming a sort of clash of civilizations. If you look at the world map and you see where American troops are right now, Western troops, they're across Africa and Asia. Now, many people in the bazaars, in the streets, in the shanty towns are beginning to feel that, is this indeed a clash of civilizations taking place? So as George had said in his very eloquent introduction, we really need to be asking some very hard questions. Where are we going to be going from here?
I have to say I'm somewhat surprised by your answer in that last time we had an opportunity to speak about this, you were resisting any characterization of a clash of civilizations.
Since then, John, if you look at the world news from Morocco to Indonesia, you have processions, 200, 300, 400,000 people coming out and protesting, and the symbol of the wrath, of the anger, seems to be America. So immediately you have a crystallization of ideas, and we need to be asking what is going on. And I think it's a very important question, because there are all kinds of things happening across the world, not only in Muslim societies, in most what are called developing societies.
Joyce, could you weigh in on your definition of what the problem is that we're talking about?
Well, I can't say that I disagree with Dr. Ahmed. Unfortunately, it seems that when I do interviews in the Muslim world, what comes back to me frequently is that America is at war with Islam. There is the perception, at least, whether rightfully or wrongly, that the United States has a vendetta against Islam. Despite attempts by the Bush administration to downplay that, to simply say we're after extremists, we're after terrorists, not after Islam. That perception persists in the Muslim world.
So all the careful rhetoric of the administration and attempts to get the message out through Al Jazeera and other means is not resonating?
Well, the problem is that he stepped off on the wrong foot by declaring the war against terrorism a crusade. And when I bring up that, well, he backed down from that and he didn't mean to say that, the response I get is that this is the United States of America's president. He doesn't make mistakes with his language.
Oh,
that's but that's what I get.
That's a good line. Joyce, let me ask you on that. Is that message, is that a universal message, or is there any modulation in it? I mean, if you speak to people in the university world or the world of journalism that you represent, is there any sense of difference?
This is the scariest thing, frankly. I talk across the board, too. I wouldn't go and talk to people who train suicide bombers. I talk to university professors. I talk to the whole gamut. And my concern, I'll put it the way one a person at a conference, an Arab intellectual, put it. He says the United States knows it has a problem when the vodka-drinking Arab finds common ground with the extremist.
Wow.
David, in some ways, our attention has shifted from events in Afghanistan and the search for bin Laden and al-Qaeda to the goings-on in Israel between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Is this a blip, or is this where the real focus of this clash is going to be played out?
Look, I think there's a lot of elements here to this clash, and there's issues here of hundreds of years. I mean, that's hard in a few sound bites on Al Jazeera to reverse. And I think we got to be very cautious and not having such high expectations and then saying, oh, you know, there's no hope. I mean, I think this is a long-term approach. I think many Muslims don't know, for example, that basically the last 3 wars the U.S. is engaged in, it was on the side of the aggrieved Muslim party, whether it's the Albanian Muslims, whether it's the Bosnian Muslims, whether it's the Kuwaiti Arab Muslims who were attacked by a fellow Arab state, whether it's also the humanitarian interventions in Somalia. I mean, most people don't know that, and I think it is worth repeating. Now, the issue goes much deeper than the Arab-Israel issue. The Arab-Israel issue, I think, is a part of it, and it's now resonating strongly, and Al Jazeera is certainly amplifying that. But let's be clear that I think that, certainly I think in the Arab world, I think people aren't aware that you've had 50 years of state-run media in these countries where a journalist, an Arab journalist, and I served as a journalist for 12 years, and I would talk to my fellow Arab journalists, and I would say to them, what about criticizing your own government in terms of its shortcomings? And they'd laugh at me, and they said, if I would print that, I'm finished. I would lose more than just my job. And what we're allowed to criticize is the United States and Israel. So you've got 50 years of this kind of artificial. I'm not saying that American and Israeli policy should not be criticized, by the way. I want to be clear about that on certain times. But it's so much bigger. But if 50 years you've got like a propaganda machine that you're not allowed to criticize your own governments, you can only demonstrate against America and Israel, And then when the crisis erupts, it's seen against that 50 years of backdrop. And so I'm not trying to, again, say that some of it is not heartfelt, but it's partly, I think, a device by these regimes to deflect criticism from themselves and cast it on others, because there's not been a lot of accountability in these regimes. I mean, we've seen a lot of failed states. So I think we've got a huge problem. Should we solve the Arab-Israel conflict? Absolutely. Will that solve the problem? In my view, definitely not.
Let me, if I detect a kind of a thread that we've been sort of pulling out here in our conversations, to take David's comment most recently and Joyce's very eloquent statement, and of course Akbar's as well. And let me address Akbar first on this one. We're talking about clashes. Is the clash really between the Islamic world or the Arab world and America as much as it is between that part of the world and modernity, that part of the world and what modern civilization is requiring or demanding?
I think, George, you brought out a very interesting and important nuance. David had talked about the Palestinian-Israel clash, and I think there is a tendency for us to all focus on that part of the, particularly in America. And there's a problem, because very often then you equate Palestinian to Islam, and therefore Islam overall becomes involved in this debate. Take Afghanistan. Now, there are two distinct wars being fought there. There's the war on terrorism, American-British troops involved. There's another war going on, which is the real ethnic, local, indigenous war. The warlords fighting each other,
right,
which have very little to do with what else is happening, but they're going to suck in that first war. So you'll have two wars coalescing, and you'll then have real complications. And that is the next phase that's beginning. So your point that, in a sense, you have these warlords in the 21st century. Here's modernity. You're talking modernity, you're talking of roads, communications, freedom, democracy. This is a challenge for people living in that part of the world to really come into the 21st century. And here you have these feudals and warlords wanting very much to assert their own interpretation of history onto these people. So you do have that clash taking place. So there's several layers to this, and I think it's important to bring out these nuances. Otherwise, we simply simplify things. And we just say clash of civilizations. Islam means bad, West means good, modernity means good, tradition means bad, and then we have problems of understanding.
Absolutely.
But play that out to a conclusion. Does that suggest that there is no negotiable here, that in essence we have to wait out a generation?
John, again, a very interesting question, because when people, your title for instance, where do we go from here? That assumes, implicit in this title is the fact that somehow that chapter is over. To me, the chapter is not over. The game has just begun. If you look at the history of Afghanistan, for instance, the history of Afghanistan begins to come alive when Kabul falls. That is when the problems begin. And already you're seeing troops getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the tribal areas. Now, I've been in charge of Waziristan, which is where the fighting is now. This is where British troops have just simply disappeared. They're very, very difficult terrain, very tough fighters who are fighting their own battles. Very little to do with America or Osama bin Laden. They are being sucked into this now. And they love a scrap. They've been there for 2,000 years. They've been fighting for 2,000 years. So, again, the objective, where are we going to be ending with all this? What is the objective?
Yeah, the cultural differences run deep in this case. Americans are always thinking of an end game, a quick solution.
That's right. It's over, we come back, Kabul has fallen, we've taken over, that's right. And if you see the history in that part of the world, the three great wars with the British, then with the Soviets, it is exactly that. The pattern is the same. Kabul falls, game is up, people assume the battle is over, and then the real battle begins. That's when the tribal dimension comes into play. And there they're playing their own politics, their own factions, their own ethnic confrontation.
Eternally. There's so many dimensions to this, so many facets. And I want to address the question of Joyce, if I might, because I'm looking forward to this book, Joyce, by the way. It's coming out. Because it's reality on the ground, if I may characterize it, and I hope I don't mischaracterize it in saying that. And in terms of reality on the ground, let me just toss one word out here, because it's a loaded word, and let's see if we can get your sense of it. When we use the word terrorism in this country, that has its obvious meaning. You, in your interviews and your conversations, when you bring that subject up, what reaction do you get? How is it defined among the audiences you've spoken to in the Islamic world in the Middle East?
Well, let me preface that by saying this. 2 points have been made here that I think are worth emphasizing. And one is that I think Alan is absolutely right. Even if the Israeli Palestinian or Israeli Arab issue is resolved. We still have a very deep issue within Arab societies about the governments and about U.S. supporting what many Arabs believe are despotic regimes in the region. That is a powder keg that's waiting to ignite. But the other thing is that in many cases what I am seeing in some of the interviews, and I'm wondering, and many people are, if there is not also a war within Islam that is being fought. And I say this based on what you're saying when you bring up the word terrorist. In talking to many Islamic scholars, very respected people, you get different attitudes about suicide bombers. You get different attitudes about terrorism, what their definition of terrorism. But what I think you have got unanimously, from what I can see, is a condemnation of September 11th. So even though you have people who are hijacking planes claiming to do so in the name of Islam, I go to people such as Sheikh Yassin and speak to him directly with Hamas, the militant Islamic group in the West Bank. I go to people like Sheikh Fadlallah with Hezbollah, interviewed him in his offices in Lebanon. They all say September 11th went beyond the bounds of Islam. So there is a debate going on within Islam now about just what its teachings really are.
I think this is a very important point, George, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this point in the Western media, and I'm glad that Joyce, as was speaking from the horse's mouth, she's actually talked to the people on the ground. Now, if these people are unanimous in condemning the acts of September 11, then there is no question whether Islam allows it or not. Whatever some Muslims may be doing, and however they may interpret it, Islam cannot allow the taking of innocent lives, full stop. Isn't that right, Joyce, from your own interviews?
That's exactly right, except with the issue of suicide bombers.
David, you want to weigh in on this?
Okay, that was the big except. I was just about to pick up on that. I mean, I think part of the problem here, in my view, is universally a lot of the leaders who came out about condemning September 11th did it on September 12th and not on September 10th. What I mean by that was that until the wrath of the United States was focused on, and the spotlight was focused on these religious leaders, and by the way, these regimes felt a lot of heat too, with very rare exceptions. These people, in my view, were not forthcoming about killing civilians. I mean, I could give you examples about things they said, and I don't want to get into too many details, but they only did it after the fact when people said, what is, all Arabs terrorists, which is obviously not true, and no one would ever think such a thing, but they felt heat. So on the metaphorical September 12th, they condemned September 11th. But even that was qualified. Namely, if, women and children and, get blown up in a pizza parlor in West Jerusalem, or teenage girls at a discotheque in Tel Aviv, that was okay. So that's a huge problem. And I would just say this, to follow up, is that what I am heartened by in a certain way is people say clash of civilizations. What I think seems to be budding, and I would like to kind of pick up on things that Joyce and Dr. Ahmed said, is that a clash within civilizations, is that maybe it's not just enough to take on your own militants. You have to take on their ideology. In other words, if you look at the growth in Central Asia, it seems to me, of Al-Qaeda and all this, these were people who fled from Arab regimes when these Islamic fundamentalists tried to take on their own regimes and were crushed ruthlessly, I may add. And then they regrouped to countries that had weak central authority in Central Asia and said, let's try a different approach. Let's try to get the United States out of the Middle East. And by the way, bin Laden, when he made the call against the United States, it wasn't about Arab Israel. I think Israel was maybe 19th out of 20. It was first get the U.S. bases out of Saudi Arabia, and his grievances go from there. But my point is that the militants were crushed in these Arab countries, but the Arab leadership never took on the ideology of these militants, and therefore that's what has to begin. I think Musharraf, who might have certain shortcomings in other areas, here I think has been heroic, it seems to me, in making that argument that it's the ideology that these militants represent that needs to be banished because it sullies the name of Islam.
Does this momentum that you describe, what you characterize as a clash within civilizations, does this extend to this civilization, the United States? In other words, the point you made about supporting regimes that have been less than democratic and that's an understatement. Does that extend here? Will we need to go through a similar type of soul-searching, and will our policy need to change?
I think, look, the president's remarks in both the State of the Union, of course it got the axis of evil kind of took up all the media attention. But people look at those remarks that he made in that State of the Union speech and the April 4th speech on the Middle East, where he, for the first time, talked about democratization. And I'd like to tell viewers that today, Mohammed Dahlan, who's the leader of the Palestinian Preventive Security in Gaza, gave an interview to Al Hayat, the leading Arab newspaper, comes out of London. And for the first time, he said, you know, we got to look at political reform among the Palestinians. We can't start singing the old tune and expect people to keep supporting us. That is historic, in my view. I think a debate is just beginning. And it's beginning on this side of the ocean, and it's beginning on the other side of the ocean, where that disinterest of these regimes being democratic was always seen, well, we don't want to go there. It's a can of worms. I don't want to get into that. And now people are saying, you know what, if we don't go there, this September 11th is going to happen not just in the year 2001, it'll happen in the year 2002, 2003, and 2004. So that, I think, is a new element to the debate.
There's just one thing, though. I think I'd be remiss if I left unchallenged, as much as I do respect you, the statement that no Islamic leaders condemned terrorism before September 11th. That simply is not the case. And I have spoken to them directly after the bombings of the embassies, after the Cole bombing, and many moderate, respected clerics went on the record as opposing those kind of tactics.
And David, this is not correct to say Islamic leaders. You may be talking about the Middle East in specific, in particular, because throughout the Muslim world, unanimously Muslims and Muslim leaders, religious leaders, have condemned terrorism of any kind.
Okay, I meant the Arab world, and I think there are many, I could bring examples, who did not. I mean, even the morning of September 11th, you had a statement in leading Palestinian papers saying, you know, suicide bombing here is good because it continues in the noble tradition of those who blew up American Marines in Beirut in 1983. So I think we've got a work cut out for us.
Okay. As I mentioned, we'll be now involving our audience in the discussion. And I just want to tell you a little bit about them today because they represent three different groups. One is our traditional group of high school students from around the country who are here for a week-long government studies program conducted by the Close-Up Foundation. Also joining us are college students from American University who are in one of two of Professor Ahmed's classes, either the World of Islam or Dialogue of Civilizations. And then also joining us a special group of adult educators from 4 different countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Albania, and Ukraine. And they're in the United States as part of a program called DEEP. DEEP stands for Democracy Education Exchange Program. It's sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education, and here in Washington it's conducted by Street Law in cooperation with Close-Up. And so you'll be hearing from those three groups. And let's go to the first questioner from the audience. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and I'm from Wisconsin. And I was just wondering that in the near future, do you think that there could be some sort of resolution to the suicide bombings? And if so, what do you think can be done?
And you're talking specifically...
In the near future, like maybe within a year or 6 months or so.
But you're isolating just the acts of suicide bombing alone,
yes,
not the larger conflicts. Okay.
No, just suicide.
Suicide bombings is a difficult topic, and it's one I've spent, almost the past 9 months delving into very, very deeply. It will take more progress on the peace front. It will take Arafat and the Palestinians looking at this squarely and doing their best to stop it. It will take, frankly, moving people out of the way that have been responsible for that. So it's going to take a comprehensive approach, but I don't think mere military means will do it, because all I've seen is an increase, including extending it to women.
Yes, and I think it's important to point this out. I don't want to in any way seem to be justifying any kind of violence that's against Islam. But if you look at some of the motivation of these young people, and I wonder, girls your age, why should they go and blow themselves up? Something is happening in society. This is a very big question, which is motivating them to take their lives. You don't do that unless you're so pained. You have lost something, your dignity, your sense of honor. And this point comes up in, I think, one of the videos one of these girls made, who talks about the word honor. That her honor, and she's in fact not talking apparently about Sharon or Israel or blowing up Israeli citizens, but she's talking about the Arab leaders. I found that very interesting in terms of the notion of honor.
if I could just get in here. I want to be clear that, there's a lot of suffering here on all sides, and we all pray for a peace process that addresses the concerns of both sides, Israelis and Palestinians. But to me, we can't look at this issue in isolation. And I understand frustration on all sides, but it seems to me that the reason why, to me, it's so pernicious and this has to be uprooted is because it's not a tactic purely of frustration of teenagers or anything like that. It is a strategy being encouraged by leadership, which in my view, it's deplorable because there was an effort to end this conflict with President Clinton towards the end. Would have given 97% of the West Bank. I don't want to get into all the details, but there was a way to end this thing peacefully in keeping with the spirit of Oslo. And it seems to me, instead of saying, well, you don't like 97% counteroffer and let's go to solve it around the table, you have people, going the streets. And when Arafat goes on Al Jazeera and talks about being a martyr for Jerusalem, that is the equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater. I think we need to be very clear about that. And I think, therefore, the president was also right in calling it for what it is, terrorism. And I think he was right in urging the Arab leaders to denounce this. And I think without that context of the leadership, there are a lot of frustrated people out there in a lot of different contexts, but they don't blow themselves up. Somehow, without the support of the leadership, I don't think this would be happening. And therefore, I think the president is right to put his finger on it, and at the same time, to try to pursue this peace process in a way to get us back on track.
I need to, unlike your morning newspaper, you don't have to wait till tomorrow for a correction. I said Albania. Actually, our visitors are from Armenia. And our senior producer, Joe Garrity, reminds me that people have died for less than what I just said. My apologies to our visitors from Armenia. Let's go to our next question.
Hi, my name is Saeed. I'm from Rochester Hills, Michigan. And my comment is this. As an American Muslim, I find that Muslims in this country are experiencing mixed signals when we face the dialogue about Islam. For example, Mr. Makovsky, you mentioned that you found Prime Minister or President Musharraf of Pakistan heroic for his challenging ideology. Yet yesterday he voted himself in almost unanimously to a 5-year extension of his dictatorial powers. Now, what happens is that it is confusing for a Muslim to, on the one hand, herald the virtues of America, including democracy and democratization, while on the other hand you find governments like Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran crushed by a CIA-led coup. You find that today's tyrants and dictators in the Arab world who are extolled tomorrow are excoriated. I was wondering if I could get some input from the panel as to how Muslims in this country should face and deal with the intellectual schizophrenia about this.
Sure.
Thank you.
I would just like to, I thought I caveated it, but if I wasn't understood properly, I'd like to say it again. When I said there's some problematic aspects, I was afraid to get too off on a tangent because I try to compact a lot of issues in, but I obviously agree with you that there's no excuse for anything like that, and I certainly don't want to be seen as excusing that in any way. So if that wasn't clear, you've given me the opportunity to make myself clear. Thank you.
I think one of the most heartening things that I've seen actually over the past 10 years since I've been in Washington covering international affairs and these issues is the growing activism of Muslim Americans and Muslims in this country. I think their voices are very clearly being heard on many of these issues right now. I think we would benefit from having an increase, from having that mirror of conscience held up to our leaders, and so I would encourage them to speak out on these issues.
Can I jump in on that? Because I was, as we sit here and talk about dialogue, I'm wondering about reciprocity and who's responding on the other side. And if you don't mind me directing to you, are you part of these kinds of discussions? Do you actively participate?
Yes, I do. I actually am director of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which is a Michigan-based think tank where we analyze mostly social and domestic U.S. policy, for example, the Human Genome Project and its emerging issues, both in the developed and the developing world, but certainly in the realm of Islam in general.
I think this is a great opportunity after September that Islam has in the Muslim community in America to be heard, to interact, to explain themselves, their culture, and what they can bring to the table. America's great strength is its richness in terms of the immigrant population here, and the Muslims have something to contribute, and as Joyce says, they are contributing. And again, after September, they have the opportunity. It's a great opportunity.
I agree. Can I extend that just briefly with you, Akbar? Can that same dialogue between as you are an eminent scholar and author, our scholars, our authors, our intellectual community, find its correspondence in the Islamic world?
It has to be, George, because dialogue by definition means people exchanging opinions. I would very much like to see a much more vigorous dialogue in the Middle East, and there's so many people wanting this dialogue. You know, you get people breaking through all kinds of stereotypes, all kinds of barriers in South Asia between Hindus and Muslims. This has to happen because the world we are living in is a very complicated, a very dangerous and a very violent world. And this dialogue across, as you say, cultures in that region has to come. And America again can give us
dialogue. He knew that. Yes, ma'am. Hi.
Hi, my name is Laura Howland. I'm from Marshall, Michigan. We're addressing where we feel our country needs to move on from after September. And I feel that as a society, we can truly see that when we're advanced is when our country can live in peace with other cultures and different religions and nations. And I was just wondering if you feel that the U.S.'s continued expansion of the quote-unquote war on terrorism is making the realization of this dream next to impossible.
When you say quote-unquote, are you expressing some cynicism about the terminology? Do you accept this as a war?
Perhaps, yes.
Okay.
That the war on Iraq is going to be extremely problematic if it comes to that. There are growing signs that the Bush administration is serious about unseating Saddam Hussein. When I was in Jordan in November, there was a great deal of fear and trepidation. That country will be extremely impacted by any war, as will much of the region. I think the concern is that as we move against these countries like Iraq, we don't necessarily have a plan for what comes next. And so while that necessarily shouldn't be a reason to simply accept a horrible status quo, as I think everyone would agree Saddam Hussein might represent, there's still concern that it could unleash forces that we are not prepared to deal with.
You see, what does the war achieve ultimately? Everything has an objective. If you have a war, you remove the government, and then you bring in reform, education, democracy, which is really what is needed in the Muslim world. Education, democracy, and a sense of dignity. Ordinary Muslims today feel they've lost dignity. And as David says, very often they direct it at their own governments, who very often direct it towards America. So if the people there feel that they've regained their dignity, their own culture, their own tradition, there's no reason for them to go around throwing bombs at people. And that has to happen.
I couldn't agree more with Dr. Ahmed. I mean, in the case of Saddam Hussein, and I'm sure we'll have a vigorous debate as that date approaches, yes, Joyce is right that people have to think about the day after. I hope the thinking is along Dr. Ahmed's line of not replacing a dictator with a dictator. But let's be clear about Saddam. I mean, this is a guy who gassed his own people with chemical weapons, gassed Kurds, gassed Iranians. When it comes to weapons of mass destruction, he doesn't just have them, he uses them. And with technology, he can deliver them, too. I mean, coming to a theater near you. So let's be clear that we're in a new era where technology means people are just much more vulnerable than ever before. And I think that's what's driving Bush, not kind of cliche Hollywood lines of, oh, the vendetta of the father and all this. I mean, the issue is a profound one, but I hope it's followed up with some thinking about creating the society along the lines Dr. Ahmed said.
Is a move on Saddam and Iraq even a question any longer? If you listen to the rhetoric recently, people are talking about it now as an inevitability.
And what's interesting is I was at a conference in Europe in which it seems as if, though the Europeans don't agree, they may be getting adjusted to the idea.
Yeah, the news coverage has changed.
I must tell you, I've talked to leading Arab officials who quietly will say, look, if this thing is done quickly, compactly, in a way that doesn't destabilize others, we're quietly for it. We can't say it publicly, but we're for it. So
Akbar, is that
what they say publicly and what they say privately might be a bit different. but it depends if it's done in a way that's not protracted.
I would agree, John, that there is this kind of split vision. But the important aspect is the street, the Muslim street. And it is volatile, it is dangerous, it is angry. And it is angry because of the points I've raised. They want to be part of the 21st century. They're seeing television, they're seeing how other people are living. Why can't they have the same kind of life? They want their own culture, their own tradition, their own dignity.
Exactly.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Hasina Sherjan. I'm the executive director of Afghanistan LEAP. We're an organization working in Afghanistan right now, helping with the education system. And I'm from Afghanistan. I've been living in Afghanistan now since December 22nd. I'm surprised, as everybody else, hearing Dr. Ahmed speak about clash of civilization, because as far as I know, you were giving seminars about how to create dialogue of civilization. And I wonder if that has anything to do with the new development in Pakistan, if that had any impact on you changing your mind. Also, I need to say something about what's been going on in Afghanistan. I hear that this program is about where we're going from here. And from what I see in Afghanistan, we're going to have a nice, peaceful society, and everybody's very happy. There's music in town. There is enough water this year. We're out of drought. People are planting flowers and trees, and schools have opened up, and kids are coming back to school. Teachers are teaching. Women are back to work. There's very little conflict between ethnic groups, and there are a few, there will always be. Now we have an element in Afghanistan that will always create some disruption in some part of the country, and that is between the commanders who have, of course, after 25 years of war, the impact that left on our leaders and commanders. We don't call them militia leaders or warlords, because we have a little more respect for these people who have been fighting for 25 years to free their country. And they, of course, the impact of the war, we will always have some discomfort in some part of the country. And Joyce said earlier that they're on the outside it looks like we're fighting terrorism, but in fact we're against Islam. Why do you think that is? Why is this administration against Islam, or why the rest of the Western world are against Islam? Why do you think that is?
Do you feel as if the world is against Islam?
No, I don't think that the world is against
I think you may have misunderstood. What I was saying was that when I have talked to people in the Middle East, Muslim leaders, their perception is that the U.S. has declared war on Islam. That is not my perception. My perception is that the United States is actually trying very hard, though not necessarily always taking the right steps, but it is trying not to declare a war on Islam. But unfortunately, people in the region don't necessarily see it that way.
And Joyce, I agree with you. You had President Bush going to the Islamic Center. Right. You had all the senior officials reaching out, having meetings, conferences, visiting mosques. There is a great attempt at that level. But again, you're right that the perception out there is precisely this. That
well, the other issue, too, is that inside the United States, so many Muslim leaders, so many Muslim organizations, for example, the FBI raid on some of them, some of them that I know, these people, and they're very respectable people. In fact, one of them, Dr. Al-Alwani, I had an interview with him, and he went on the record urging Muslim American soldiers to be loyal to this country at a time when it was most unpopular to do. So these are people who have proven themselves in very difficult times, and I've watched them very closely. And when you attack folks like that, those are the very people we need to help us through this time.
And that has puzzled the Muslim community, puzzled, angered, confused them, because this man, the person Joyce mentioned, I haven't met him, but he actually issued a fatwa saying that American Muslims can fight shoulder to shoulder with Americans against Muslims.
And they have a duty to do so.
I think, first of all, President Bush has acted in an extraordinary manner when he, right after September 11th, he made clear, I think it was a moment of pride for this country, you know, urging fellow Americans to be respectful to Muslim Americans. I think that was very important, and I'm sure, you know, the large majority of these organizations are very good, but, you know, there have been a few of them that have been doing some money laundering. I'm sure it's a very small minority. I want to make clear. to Hamas, to Islamic Jihad, to Hezbollah, a lot of these groups. And therefore, there's been some concern about the minority. But I don't think anyone's casting aspersions on the large majority.
Well, maybe yes and no, David. I mean, I fully agree in commending the president for what he did. I thought that was marvelous. And I also agree that it's a minority of almost anyone doing anything, right. Thank God. But there is the issue, for example, of racial profiling. And everywhere from airports to FBI haul-ins. And this is, I think, where there's some very difficult questions of civil liberties and respect for them among our Arab American brothers and sisters that is being raised.
Okay, let's go to our next question. Yes, sir.
События 11 сентября, безусловно, имеют симптоматический характер.
The events of this September 11th, of course, are symptomatic in a way.
И мне хотелось бы задать вопрос методологического характера.
And I have a question of methodological sort of character.
Если даже не говорить о этих событиях как проявлении столкновения цивилизаций,
even if we don't treat these events as clash of civilizations,
насколько оправданным, по-вашему, является частичный такой эпизодический подход к решению подобного рода проблем?
To what extent it's justified that the approach to dealing with these events, the aftermath of these events, is kind of episodic, that is partial?
И не видите ли вы каких-то трудностей, связанных с развитием событий в той части мира, которая образовалась на месте сферы влияния бывшего Советского Союза?
And you probably envisage lots of difficulties in dealing with this part of the world, which is now the former Soviet Union republics. Which the difficulties resulting from what happened and what you're doing there.
Я спрашиваю об этом, потому что я из Киева, с Украины, и зовут меня Владимир.
And I'm asking all this because I live in this part of the world. My name is Vladimir. I'm from Kiev, the capital of Ukraine.
Thank you.
Are you asking? Are you indicating that we should look at it as a clash of civilization? I didn't quite.
Я думаю, что не должны мы это пока рассматривать, но в любом случае сложная эта проблема является симптоматичной. То есть в процессе развития событий это может вырасти в столкновение.
No, I don't think it should be treated as a clash of civilizations, but I do believe that what's happening and what happened is very symptomatic because of what you're doing there, and in a way it might lead eventually to the clash of civilizations.
Именно в этой связи меня интересует место и роль и проблемы на вот этом постсоветском пространстве.
And in this respect, I'm really interested in what are the issues to be tackled in this post-Soviet world, in the countries of the former Soviet Union.
Well, the post-Soviet world is a post-modern world in the sense that the processes of globalization are doing two contradictory things at the same time. One is creating an artificial unity in the world because we are instantly hooked in through television and the media. Secondly, it's allowing people to fall back to the individual because the intermediary structures are falling away. The state is almost irrelevant. The tribe or the nation is fading. So you have this global perception of belonging to the world, and then you have yourself. And very often when you fall back on yourself, you're confused, you're angry, you feel that somehow injustice is all around you, and therefore some of these actions, sometimes irrational actions, take place.
As you said, I mean, sometimes we have to look for the silver lining. I mean, we've been talking about some depressing things here during this program. And I think sometimes it's important to tell people some good news, too. And it's related to what this questioner said, in my view. It's an amazing consensus is emerging, I think, in this country, from the most neoconservative on the right, most liberal on the left, of a new, I realize the question is from the Ukraine, not from Russia, but you mentioned the post-Soviet world. I think people talk about a U.S.-Russian alliance in this war against terrorism. A lot of things that seemed unthinkable. If we would be having this conversation a year ago, let alone a decade ago, people would say unbelievable. But the fact is people are realizing as all these old ideologies fade away of the Cold War that there are a lot of prospects for cooperation. And I think that this could be a defining moment. not necessarily, an issue of tactical convenience about a specific ad hoc problem, but a defining moment to bring old adversaries together from Moscow, from Washington, and work together on common problems. That should have been apparent really since the fall of the Berlin Wall in the late 80s. But it took maybe a catastrophe like this to kind of shake people up and to say, no more of this old think, let's join hands. And it's really a consensus, and then from what I'm hearing of people in former Soviet Union feel a lot the same way. So I think we got to also talk about some positive things that are happening in that regard, and I see this as one of them.
Thanks for raining on our gloom and doom with that optimism. Yes, sir, you're next.
Hello, I'm Mike Morrow. I attend Kentwood High School in Covington, Washington. It was touched on a little bit earlier, but following September 11th, the president said that we were going to seek out and destroy all forms of terrorism as it is now on the planet. Yet, in our foreign policy, we still back and send military weapons to countries like Israel, who are known for terrorism. I just wanted to know, this is not a direct criticism of the president, but was the president a hypocrite in this?
Well, I think we have to ask you first for your definition of terrorism, because whenever we start a discussion with that word, I think that's what everyone needs to hear, because there are assumptions contained in your question. What are you defining as terrorism in this regard?
My version of terrorism is anything that interferes with freedom, or
anything that
not interferes, but an attack on freedom.
A physical attack, not a political movement.
It could be either way. Most times, words and political alignments can be very influential.
That's a pretty broad definition. So really, you're talking about anything anti-democratic.
Correct.
I almost give up defining terrorism because, I just simply say what happened and let people determine for themselves if it's terrorism. But, I mean, you're stepping on some slippery ice when you simply declare Israel a terrorist. I mean, that's, I'm not going to go there. But, clearly there are issues to look at in the behavior of both sides, including the behavior of the United States in this conflict. And that, I think, is where we're headed. We need to figure out a way that we can get past the brutality that we've seen in the region back to a negotiating table.
I agree with Joyce, and I think that, we almost had a two-state solution in the year 2000, that we would have had two states by now. I think, for whatever reason, the Palestinian side didn't accept it. I think we got to get back on track and maybe deal with some issues of political reform that were kind of papered over, but given what we've learned since, need to happen, given like this comment of Dahlan and others about a new future. And I'm hopeful that despite all the tragedy, that it's possible. I obviously think, the questioner's remark, frankly, is just totally baseless and out of bounds.
Okay. Next question, please.
My name is Jeff Leister. I'm from Kalamazoo, Michigan. And my question is, what do you think it will ultimately take to end the crisis in the Middle East? And how much worse do you think it will get before it starts to get better?
Mm-hmm.
Well, good question.
Well, Alan actually keeps saying something that I think is worth emphasizing.
I should say David. I should say.
Sorry, Dave. I'm sorry. Sorry.
Alan, maybe.
But maybe you're talking about Alan.
Relative.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. But anyway, I think that he emphasizes one thing. We really were very close to an agreement. We had at least some very creative thinking on Jerusalem. We had people batting their ideas around and coming up with ideas for the refugee issue. And so we could taste at least the beginning of a resolution. I think if we could get back to that point.
Why did it break down?
Yes, I've been dying to ask
that's
oh,
boy.
Closest to horseshoes and quaits, I think,
Right.
is the
Who
old
backed up and
adage.
who dropped the ball?
My view of this, I'm writing a book on this subject, so it's
Give us a preview.
dangerous to... I'm frankly of the view that it wasn't because of problems of miscommunication these two leaders, of Barak and Yasser Arafat, and add Bill Clinton to the mix. Although, you could always find mistakes here or there. I feel, I hate to say this and kind of be a skunk at a garden party here, but I feel that Arafat's ideological commitments on certain issues, frankly, did not provide the sort of peace that is required on Jerusalem and on the refugee issue. Everyone's saying refugees need to be repatriated to go back to a state of Palestine, but that's why there's two states: Palestinians to Palestine, Jews to Israel.
Is there any agreement or disagreement with the reason?
And I would, in my view, that's just really that those two issues are going to be problems in the future unless we realize.
I believe what David is saying, that eventually you must see the Palestinian people living on their own, with their own state, with dignity. You must have security for Israel. They must live as good neighbors and learn to respect and even get on with each other. The problem is this, David, with the amount of antipathy and hatred that is building up, I see it very difficult, even if you do have two states. How are they going to live as neighbors? You see the example of India and Pakistan, which in a sense broke from one womb, if you like, and after 1947 have had 3 wars. And right now they have the armies out on the borders, eyeball to eyeball, both nuclear. So the importance of goodwill on both sides, of generous gestures on both sides, I think you really need...
I agree, but what you're saying, Dr. Ahmed, frankly, reinforces my view that you need to define a peace process about reconciliation. You see, between the Israelis and the Egyptians, you had the advantage of a 100-mile desert in between them. So the peace agreement was a divorce. Once you sign that agreement, one side goes one side, one goes the other way. You don't see each other again. So the quality of the relationship is really a footnote. With the Israelis and the Palestinians, the history is very loaded. There's just, frankly, too much history, too little geography. And therefore, when they live on top of each other, the quality of the relationship is at the core. It's not a footnote. And therefore, peace needs to be defined as a reconciliation process. And in my view, Arafat has failed the leadership test in not defining it as such.
A reconciliation process in which the international community plays a strong role, right? So there has to be some monitoring to avoid the Pakistan India.
We're going to try to get one more question here before we run out of time for this segment. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Mallory Havens, and I'm from Rockford, Michigan. And I was wondering if you thought the tolerance education between Israeli and Palestinian youth is going to be effective or have any kind of success now that violence has increased in the area.
You know, whenever you go fishing for a final question, you're always holding your breath that it won't be. When will a nuclear device be delivered to? So thank you for giving us a chance to end on an up note. And we have about 45 seconds left for each of you to weigh in on the question of teaching tolerance.
Well, it's essential we try. We have to.
I agree.
Professor.
Ditto.
Mr. Seay.
I agree with the three of them. And quite frankly, the future is with you. And I'm so glad you asked that question and you have that concern. So go for it.
You see what it takes to get people to
you even have seconds to spare.
I'm not sure what I think. I'm going to mull it over for the next 30. No. Let me just take a few minutes. Thank you very much for your question. Take a few minutes to provide some thank yous. This is the last in our series of 2002 Close Up at the Wilson Center productions, but we hope to return, George, next year for our 5th year already. How time flies when you're having fun.
When we're having fun.
And hopefully conducting some
as long as we can have sessions like this, we're up for
discussions. Yeah. Let me start by thanking our guests. Let me thank David Makovsky, Joyce Davis, and Akbar Ahmed for joining us today. Also, all of you on the DEEP program, the Close-Up program, and those of you who joined us from American University. And I want to take an opportunity, George, since this is our last get-together for this year, to thank some of the people behind the scenes. Those of us at Close-Up would like to extend our thanks to the director here at the Wilson Center, Lee Hamilton, his assistant, Ken Nelson, and then the guy I really want to say thank you to, John Tyler. You know, there's always an unsung hero behind the scenes who does the heavy lifting.
Hardest working man in show business.
Yes, the hardest working man in showbiz, John Tyler. Thanks to, on behalf of all of us at Close-Up, I want to thank all of you. We will return to the museum next week for our next production. Hope you'll join us then. Until then, for all of us at the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Close-Up Foundation, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for watching.
We're at the College of Physicians.